Okay. And 3, 2, 1. Chapter 1. Gridiron. Borthak sat huddled beneath his threadbare cloak and thought about the spines. There had been 6 of them once. Each one had hung from the roof of his chieftain's tent, held together with wire and hempen rope, the thick, pitted ivory polished smooth and carved with symbols of all manner. Curses, blessings, hopes and prayers. Dreams, wishes, commands for the gods, and treaties to the spirits. A prayer for the rains to come, a prayer for the rains to stop. Oh, bless us with a mild winter that we may survive this famine. Oh, bless us with a harsh winter that our foes may starve. Spirits, visit upon us the summer sun that our crops may grow plentiful. And spirits, take away this blazing summer heat that this drought may end. If the spirits cared at all to listen to the pleas of mortals, and in Bor's whole life he'd seen no evidence that they had, they must have been fucking confused reading those spines. Each individual vertebrae was its own little prayer wheel, crammed to the spiritual rafters with conflicting demands. He reached over to his meagre fire, flipping the fish in his gridiron. The trout sizzled, smoky and fragrant, the air tingling with the smell of charcoal and wood chips. Resting back on his haunches, he watched the reflections from his cook fire dancing on the shifting mirror surface of the lake. The water was dark in the settling gloom of twilight, save for his lonely fire and the first stars peeking hungrily from behind the veil of night. 6 spines, 6 champions. 6 of the tiger's most dangerous bastards, chieftains and war leaders all. Viger Bloodtooth, all 7 feet of him, built like a bear and wielding a club which looked for all the world like half a pine tree with the branches roughly stripped. 7 years of raids on the northern settlements, and a warband 8 dozen strong. Carib Jaw with his axe of bare teeth, his 500 barely leaving the deep forest except for the odd raid on human settlements in the bleakest winters. A full dozen years they'd spent hunting moose and fox alike on all 4s, scarcely more than beasts themselves. Bor had torn the bones from the backs of both of them, them and more besides. The problem, he thought to himself as he jabbed, frowning at the smouldering embers of his cook fire, is that none of them wanted anything permanent. Sure, fight your way up from the bottom, get yourself a warband, then what? Raiding human villages? Hunting the beasts of the forests? Maybe plant yourself the odd crop in the warm seasons enough to see you through the winter? Moving, always moving, never setting down roots, never building anything. Hunt, fight, eat, drink, fuck. A warm tent, a pile of furs, some meat in your belly, someone curled up by your side for the night. That was enough for most of them. Hell, it was enough for damn near all of them. Always had been. And if the stories were to be believed, his people had lived the same lives since before the stars popped into the sky, since before the mountains had sprang from the ground, before the small folk had crawled from their oceans and caves. Blood, instinct, and pure, unbridled hedonism. Borthak, though, he'd wanted more. He'd had it too. Hadn't worked. It was never going to. Permanent, nah. Humans now, they knew about permanent. Up here in the north, atop the hard earth and beneath the gelid sky, they'd carved out settlements and villages, tradesmen, hunters, trappers, farmers, brewers, bakers, fishermen, potters, tailors, cobblers, coopers. Even in a small village like this, the sheer breadth of things they found to occupy their time took his breath away. And so it was that, in the aftermath of his grand ambitions, he'd turned and walked away from the wreckage of his old life, his failures and his hubris. Tramping through the tundra for weeks, he'd eventually come to a ramshackle village and took up residence in an abandoned fishing hut on the outskirts. He hadn't asked permission on account of his not understanding the concept. And here I am, he thought, munching away absent-mindedly on his fish, still watching the reflections dance in the water. 3 months later. Bor couldn't remember the last time he'd spent 3 months in the same place. It was going well, too, all things considered. The humans left him alone. Not a one of them had said a word of him since he'd moved in. I mean, the first night he'd seen scared, sunken faces watching him from what could be called, if you were feeling generous, the town square. In the end of the first week, he'd seen a group of farmers with torches and pitchforks huddled up in the centre of the square, shooting nervous glances towards his hut, and he'd prayed to the spirits like never before that they wouldn't try it. In the end, they'd all shuffled off to their homes, and he'd breathed a sigh of relief. Since that night, blessed nothing, save for the worried stares when he was outside tending his garden. The garden, now, that was something. He'd found a few herbs on one of his first foraging trips around the lake and had brought some cuttings back to grow. It had turned into quite the collection, small bunches growing in measured plots, with everything from seasoning for food to cures for stomach aches. He'd built a bench, too, out of driftwood, as well as a fire pit using some good-sized rocks from the shale beach down the way. He'd got his fur pile just the way he liked it, right next to the small, rusted oven he'd inherited with the shack. He had his chopped logs in a pile for his fires, stored in a basket he'd weaved from branches and twigs. He had a few drying racks covered in smoked fish he'd caught from the lake, and he'd tied off a stretch of fraying hemp rope he'd found across the ceiling, hung with garlands and drying herbs. He even had plates and mugs. Ratty old tin things that they were. I mean, they were his, and they stayed where he put them. Permanent. That was the thing. It was lonely, it was quiet, it was boring, but spirits knew it was the most wonderful thing he'd ever done with his life. Eating the last of his fish, he tilted the battered old tin plate he'd been eating off of, making the lights from the fire catch and glint in the pocked, dented surface, and he smiled as though he was admiring a treasure beyond value. His smile faded as he heard the shouting begin. The unmistakable beat of hooves, the raised voices, and that tone. He'd never used it himself, of course. Never needed to. Raids on human settlements didn't involve much in the way of negotiation, and fights between kinsmen were usually swift, bloody, and entirely lacking in foreplay. He'd heard the tone, however, during the boasts over empty bottles, the younger ones shouting their pride, screaming their defiance, goading each other on while trying to catch the eyes of whichever of their peers had caught their eye that night. It said, "Oh, don't try me, and you're lucky they're holding me back." It shouted, "Don't make me kill you," while it whispered, "I don't know if I'd win." It was the sound of bravado painted thin over fear, and it worked about as well as roses made shit smell sweet. Boar studied his face in the reflection of that battered tin plate as he spun it idly in his hands. Behind him, in the distance, he could see the orange blossoming of torchlight. The raised voices grew louder. To his surprise, there were cries of fear below the raised voices. He tilted his head sideways, listening more intently. No, not coming for him then, as he'd first thought. Some kind of attack, bandits, perhaps. It happened out here in the wild sometimes, when the thieving men grew desperate enough. For a brief moment, he wondered if it was a raid, his people, a war band from up north. But no, his people were all gone now. Boar looked at himself in the plate a moment longer, silhouetted in the denting metal by the distant firelight, considering. Then, reverently, he placed the tin plate down next to his cook fire and rose with a soft grunt. He twisted his upper body left to right, working the clicks and snaps out of his spine, loosening his shoulders with a shake. Turning, he strode away from his camp, towards the shouts and the flames. If this was going to be his home now, if this was really going to be his permanent, then he'd be damned if he was going to let someone come here and rob it. Chapter 2. Cronyism. 5 men stood in a rough semicircle in the town's market square, a sixth away off behind them holding the reins of a half-dozen sallow-looking horses. The shouting had stopped, and from this distance Borthak could see one of the townsfolk sprawled on the floor, a second figure crouching beside them, shadowed in the torchlight. Before them, one of the bandits held a sword out, pointing at the fallen villager's chest. The rest of the townspeople huddled 10 paces or so back from this frozen scene, milling and scared in the gloom. Boar breathed deep and opened himself up to the blood. Slowly, carefully. Only a little. It began to thrum through his body, deep as a drumbeat. Veins throbbed, driving a savage heat through his body. Muscles, tense and stiff from hours sat on the shale of the lakeside, softened and loosened. The world became a place of shapes and colours and smells and motion. Boar strode, unhurried, into the middle of that crescent of torchlight. To his eyes it seemed overbright, saturated. He spared a glance at the fallen villager, a man, drunk, a jug on the floor beside him, flushed cheeks, unfocused eyes, a bruise below one eye starting to form. The figure beside him, a woman, strong, squat, broad shoulders, red hair cut short, daughter, sister, no weapons, no threat. Boar took in all this with a glance and spared them no more thought, his strides unbroken. One of the bandits called out, big man, 6 paces or so behind the leader with his sword out. The leader turned, sneering, to face Boar. "What's this?" he jeered. "A nut." He cut off as he took Boar in properly. A foot taller and half again as heavy, torchlight glinting off his tusks. He must have seemed a demon then, striding out from the gloom, pace unbroken. The leader raised his sword. In one motion, Boar caught his sword hand at the wrist. His other fist drove hard into the bandit's jaw. There was a sound like a fish dropped on a stone beach. The man's jaw split, breaking off at the hinge. He was unconscious before he hit the floor. Boar held his arm and let the momentum of the man's fall slide the sword hilt into his palm. Passing the sword from left hand to right, he turned towards the other 4 men. He brought his right foot down hard on the unconscious man's skull as he strode forward, and felt the bone give beneath his weight. It creaked and cracked, squelching as he continued his stride. He was on the men before they had time to react. Boar swung a vicious blow, right to left. It took the first man in the neck, nearly severing his head. He tore the weapon free, his backswing arcing through the next man's skull and into his eye socket. The blow split his head in half, jaw and cheek falling away. The blade remained lodged, snapping at the crossguard. The 2 closest men down, the 2 remaining a few paces away in either direction. Boar saw the man to his right move forward, blade raising above his head in both hands, preparing to strike. Boar threw the hilt of the broken sword at the man on his left. The pommel took him in the nose, smashing it flat, taking the man off his feet. He turned back to the man on his right. Stepping into his reach before the blow fell, Boar grabbed the man by his belt and collar. He pivoted at the waist, legs firm. Using the man's own momentum as he brought his blade down, Boar pulled him off his feet and slammed him head first into the hard earth like a shovel. The neck snapped, spine popping. As Boar released the body, the man's head stayed sunk into the neck like a turtle. Before the body had had time to settle on the ground, Boar was walking towards the man with the broken nose. Long, purposeful steps, unhurried. The man was rising to his knees, but Boar kicked him back down to the floor. Foot on his back, Boar put his hand in the man's mouth, 4 fingers around his upper teeth, thumb hooking into the right eye socket. Boar pushed down hard with his right foot, hunched down. He straightened his back, squared his shoulders. He stood, driving his hips forward, arms locked. The man screamed, tendons ripping. And with a wet gurgle and the sound of torn meat, Borthak pulled the man's skull free, part of the spine dangling from the base. The tongue slapped against the earth, coiling from the ragged stump of the man's neck. The final man, off at the back holding the horse's reins, watched in mute horror. The whole fight lasted seconds, a few heartbeats. He looked at the dead men, then turned horrified eyes back towards Borthak, just in time to see the thrown skull arcing towards his face. The impact knocked him off his feet, the reins dropping loose. Boar walked towards the horses and the fallen boy, and as he did so, he closed the flow of the blood. The blooming orange of the torches faded to a dull amber glow. He breathed deep, chest heaving like a bellows, as though his breath had been held. He bent, grasping 5 sets of reins in one hand. In the other, he grasped the fallen youth by his shirt and lifted him bodily. Boar held the boy off the floor, feet dangling. The bandit looked back at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Don't," said Boar simply. "Come back." He threw the boy against the flank of the remaining horse and watched him scramble onto the mare's back and gallop off. Boar took a moment to tie the horse's reins to a nearby hitching post before stepping back towards the townsfolk. The man and the woman hadn't moved. The man sprawled, and the woman crouched protectively at his side. The rest of the villagers stared silently, taking in the scene. Boar crouched and reached a hand out to the fallen man to help him up. The man scrambled back, crawling away from him, eyes wide. The woman at his side, however, just looked at him levelly, gauging. Sighing, Boar straightened. He took in the frightened crowd, the owlish stares, the growing silence. "You should fight," he said. "Next time," he added, after a long pause. The silence stretched on, nobody moving. He looked back at the dead men, their torn, broken bodies. He looked back at the villagers. "Get 'em buried," he commanded, flicking his head to the corpses. He turned and strode back to his hut. In the square behind him, nobody moved. Chapter 3. Ensconce. Neve had been up all night burying the bodies. She dragged her father back to his bed, eventually. She'd then come back to the square to find the rest of the village in huddled groups, whispering and muttering. They'd all flat refused to touch the bodies, called them cursed. Cursed! As if they'd never seen a dead man before. Well, there had been curses flying for certain before the night was through. Neve had seen to that. She'd had to dig holes and drag the mangled bodies into them on her own, spitting venom the whole time. Took her damn near till sunrise to finish it. Aye, she'd cursed all right. Cursed the whole damn lot of the lazy, superstitious bastards. And then there'd been the row this morning. Her father had woken and found her baking 2 loaves of bread. "Who's t'other for?" he'd asked. When she'd said it was to thank the man who'd saved his sorry life, he'd gone spare. Called him a beast, said no daughter of his was going traipsing off to no cabin with some foul-blooded creature like that. Her temper, already black as soot from the long night's work and lack of sleep, had burst its dams at that. She advanced on him, finger prodding his chest. "Oh, aye? And where was this manly fucking bravado last night, Didn't see you forbid nothing while you was lying in a pool of your own piss with some half-starved fucking brigand pointing half a fire poker at you," she spat. "And besides, my mother, spirits rest her, would have raised hell if we'd not thanked a man for something like this, whether he be a beast or not." Her father paled before the vitriol, taking an inadvertent step back. "Now, look," she said, calming herself with a visible effort. "I know what people have been saying, all right? Weren't anyone happy having a big fucking orc wander into town and settle down? Spirits know I weren't happy about it neither." "Aye, Bab, that's what I'm saying," her father started, but she cut him off. "But," she interjected, "what exactly has he done wrong, "Well, I mean, he's a big fucking orc, Bab, for a start," her father said, and everyone knows what they're like." "Oh, do they so?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Well, it's been 3 months now since he come here, and he ain't exactly kicked up a fuss, eh? He ain't done nothing you miserable old lot said he would, has he, eh? Ain't no daughters been dragged from they beds and had away with, ain't no one's bones been ground for a pudding. And to be honest with you, Da, all he's done so far is fish quiet-like and sit in front of his fire. Until last night," she added, meaningfully, "when he saved you lot of ungrateful bastards." "All right, Bob," her father said, exasperated, "but he's still a big bloody orc. I mean, you saw what he done to those men. It ain't right. It ain't right." "Well, I don't care about right, He done us a favour, and now I'm going to go and say thank you proper like, how Mam taught me. It's only polite. And if our man was still here, you'd have felt the back of her hand for saying I shouldn't, and you know it." He seemed to deflate at that. "I suppose I can't stop you any road up, can I?" he muttered. "No," she said simply. "That you can't. Now, get yourself washed and ready. Farmer Aben wants you down the south field helping with that broke fence. Go on now," she added, shooing him away. An hour later, she was walking down the long, winding path to the old fisherman's cottage on the lake's edge. Autumn had settled in proper now, and there was a chill in the air, though the snows had yet to come in force. The short grass under Neve's worn boots crackled and crunched with the morning frost. The sky above was clear and pale, the far mountains snow-capped. There was the occasional spot of yellow-orange on their banks from the rare few silver birches that grew in the forest of pine and fern. Beyond the cottage, the lake lay silver-grey and still. Neve could see no light from the cottage, no smoke from the chimney. Perhaps, she thought, the man may be out or still asleep. Maybe he didn't need a fire, she thought with a frown. Maybe he eats his meat raw and doesn't need a cook stove. How much did she really know about orcs anyway? Scant little outside of the stories. The cottage sat ensconced in the lee of a small rock outcropping, sheltering it from the worst of the winds blowing off the lake. A small copse of firs scattered around it, and winding between them ran a low wooden fence, rotten and broken from years of disuse. The cottage itself bore a few shuttered windows and a wooden awning over a porch of birch planks. The building itself was of strong, sturdy stone, squat and solid. Behind the cottage there was a small fenced-off garden, once used as an allotment, and the trammels ran downhill gently until it reached the edge of the lake's shale beach. She'd used to play in that garden as a girl, her and the other kids. They used to stand at the edge of the garden's fence and see who could throw a stone furthest into the still waters of the lake. She smiled, remembering. That beach edge was where the man had been seen most nights, from a distance, sitting in front of his small fire and looking out over the water. Reaching the small wooden porch, she leant down to leave her gifts on the planks outside the front door. A loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of jam made from the salmon berries that had just bloomed, a small clay jug of cow's milk, thick with fat, a small round pat of butter. She was just rising when the door opened. For all of her bold words with her father earlier, it was hard not to feel a sense of panic, her mouth going dry. The man was enormous, a good foot taller than even old Lerm, and Lerm reckoned himself 6 foot odd. He was broad as a barn door, and beneath his ragged cloak she could see his arms were cabled with thick bands of muscle. His face bore multiple old scars, and from his mouth protruded a pair of short, chipped, worn tusks. She suddenly remembered in vivid detail what she'd seen the night before, the way he had effortlessly pulled that man's head off. He'd killed 6 men in a few blinks of an eye, and they'd hardly had a chance to shout. He was, also, she realised with a start, quite young. She'd missed that last night, the gloom and flickering torchlight hiding any sense of detail. He was maybe her age, a little older perhaps. Hard to tell under all the scars. She realised she'd been staring for a few seconds now, and he hadn't moved or spoken. He stared at her with light green eyes, gauging, wearing a mild frown. She coughed. I brought you a gift to say thanks, for last night. She trailed off. Bread and milk, butter, some jam, she added awkwardly. The man slowly dropped his gaze to the pile of food on the floor. I know the folks didn't seem all that thankful last night, she went on, but they are really. They're not bad folks. They just don't know what to make of you, They've never seen one of you lot. He gazed at the food for a few more seconds, saying nothing. The trepidation started to give way to mild annoyance. It had been a very long night, and she was fed up with the men around her playing silly buggers. You could say thanks, she pointed out, brow creasing. Wouldn't kill you to be polite, would it? What? He said, his voice quiet and deep. Is jam? She stopped, wrong-footed. Jam? She asked. Well, it's, it's jam, ain't it? It's fruit. Fruit? He asked, frowning. He leant down and picked up the jar. It looked tiny in his hands. Well, yeah, it's fruit, berries. You sort of, cook it, then let it cool down. Goes sort of sticky. Good on bread. Keeps for ages, she explained hesitantly. You've, never had jam? She asked. No, he replied, looking at her. He leant, picking up the clay jug, sniffing at it. He turned it reverently in his hands as though it were precious china. Her frown deepened. This was not at all how she'd imagined this would go. You could, she found herself saying, invite me in, you know. Why? He replied, earnestly. Because it's fucking polite, she snapped, exasperated. Look, it's been a really long day, all right? And I'm fed up of folks acting fools. First, I had some fucking bandits roll into town, hoping to steal spirits only know what from us, seeing as we're in the arse end and fucking nowhere, she snarled, growing more irate. Then, some great big fucker comes wandering in out of the dark and pulls 6 men apart like swatting flies, and then he goes turning round and fucking off again with hardly a word. She pointed at him, finger waving, then swung her finger to point back at the village. And then, the useless old fuckers got so rattled they wouldn't even look at the bodies, never mind touch 'em, so fucking Muggins here had to dig 6 fucking graves all on her own, she said, voice growing to a genuine shout now. And then, I stays up all night baking fucking bread and boiling fucking jam, so I can come down here proper like and thank you for saving my da, old and drunk and useless though he may be, who, by the fucking by, gave me no end of grief for wanting to come down here. Neem took a breath, voice rising to a furious cadence. And now, I'm stood here in the freezing fucking cold, explaining how jam's made to some big fucker who's not even said fucking thank you. The big man blinked, leaning backwards slightly as she finished her tirade. She took a few deep breaths, face flushed. Now, she said more calmly, seems to me that you was fixing to stay around here, and if that's so, she continued, we're neighbours now, and that means we're going to do things proper. She stepped forward, finger still raised, jabbing. The man leant back even further. And what we're going to do now, right, is you're going to invite me inside, right? And then we're going to tell each other our names, right? And then we're going to say to each other, oh, it is nice to make your acquaintance. And then we're going to eat this fucking bread and this fucking jam, right? And you're going to say thank you, she hissed, and tell me how fucking good it is, right? And then we're going to have a proper conversation, right? Like neighbors do. And then I'm going to fucking go home and get some sleep. Do you fucking understand me? There was a long, quiet moment. Okay, he said, turning round and walking into the cottage. Neve exhaled, stooping to pick up the bread and butter off the floor. I'm, Borthak. Bor. Neve, she said, straightening. Nice to meet you, Bor.